All right, Renaissance architecture. So we're going to start today with the beginning of what is known as the Renaissance. And the Renaissance literally means rebirth. The term is defined as rebirth. And this is an era that comes right after sort of medieval Gothic era architecture in which, and it starts in Italy, as we'll see, and it really is the effort by architects and designers and planners to revive the architecture of antiquity, of ancient classical Greece, and especially Rome, the Roman Republic and Empire that we talked about in the fall semester. And it's not so much that it was completely lost, especially for those living in the Italian peninsula. The ruins, and even in some cases, some buildings and temples that had been converted into churches and so forth, those still existed, right? So it was around them, but they didn't. A lot of the technologies on how to build some of these grand buildings, these vaults, and especially domes, as we'll be talking about today, had largely been lost, or at least had fallen to where they didn't have the skills and technologies to build on the grand scale that the Romans had. And I think I'll make that clear when we talk about our subject today. And it was also an effort to try to recreate, revive this classical architecture in a more authentic way. Rather than just sort of, borrowing little bits and pieces and applying it in random ways. It was really meant to sort of recreate the arts and culture and architecture of antiquity. And this applied more to than just architecture, as those who took my class in the fall semester know. I like to sort of introduce sort of what's going on in history and in the arts in general, and I'll continue that this semester. We'll talk a little more about Renaissance art in general. And in fact, the slide here that we're seeing, this is the classical man from Leonardo da Vinci, the idea of the proportions and scale based on the human figure. And you can inscribe a circle and a square and so forth. And later on, we'll see Le Corbusier's modern 20th century architect Le Corbusier, his sort of interpretation of Leonardo da Vinci's proportions from man. So we're going to start literally in 1400, conveniently, with in Florence, Italy, with a competition to create the doors to the baptistry outside of the cathedral there. The baptistry, and I'll show you an image of it here in a moment, but the baptistry had been built previous to this. So it was sort of an Italian Gothic building. The baptistry itself was not a Renaissance building, but in 1400, the old doors to it had really deteriorated, and the building committee or whoever was, this committee that was in charge of the cathedral grounds, the building, and the baptistry itself, decided to have a competition to create, new doors that would be sculpted and cast, probably in bronze, to be placed on the building. And there were a number of entrants, but really the competition came down to between a man named Filippo Brunelleschi and Lorenzo Ghiberti, two young men who had been working largely as apprentices in the goldsmithing trade. Brunelleschi especially worked for a local goldsmith, which meant that he got a lot of experience doing casting work of metals, but also the intricacies of watchmaking, which involved precision and involved gears and so forth. And Ghiberti was even younger, but was very talented artist as well, and sort of a rising star in Florence at this time. And Florence was a community. Here's a image of a map of Italy from this era. Italy, as we know it, as a nation state, did not exist. It was a peninsula, the boot here, really divided into different duchies and republics and different states. Rome is right here. Of course, we talked about the Roman Empire previously. That had fallen really almost essentially 1,000 years earlier. And much of the area, Rome itself and the area around Rome and even up the east coast of the Adriatic Sea was controlled by the Pope himself. These were known as the Papal States, and the Pope was the ruler, the secular ruler as well as the spiritual ruler of territories. Down here at Naples or Napoli was a kingdom ruled by Naples, but we're talking about Florence up here where the star is, and that was a republic. Not quite the type of republic that we think of with United States today. It was still kind of an aristocracy of, only a select few could vote. You had to own land and property and so forth. And certainly, in this era, women were not allowed to vote, and peasants and so forth weren't allowed to vote. But it's still, by the time or in that era, was certainly more of a republic than the Papal States or the Kingdom of Naples. They had a rival in Siena, which is not too far away here. Up here in the northeast corner of modern-day Italy is Venice. That was also another republic, and they controlled a lot of the sea routes and trades with East Asia that were coming through. There was Milan, which was a duchy, and a number of others throughout. So it was a very divided area, but Florence and its territory was very wealthy. The leaders in the city and the land around it was very rich, and they were successful in their military conquests and so forth. And so by this era, they had become quite wealthy, and that, as we talked about in the fall semester, stability, political stability, and wealth really help drive the creation of great architecture. You can't really build monumental buildings in times of turmoil and political strife and warfare and so forth. Wars tend to destroy buildings, not build them. And it takes vast resources of money essentially to build a number of these buildings. And we're going to see a lot of buildings built by the church this semester because even in this era, the entity that has great wealth and power happens to be the Catholic Church. So the first few lectures on Renaissance and Baroque architecture is going to be a lot of church architecture. But the Florentines also had significant private wealth as well, which we'll be seeing helps drive the Renaissance. Okay, so here's an image of the baptistry. It was an octagonal-shaped building. It was sort of Italian Gothic in that it still had remnants of classical architecture, these sort of rounded Roman arches, sort of neo-classical columns here, and even little pediments over the windows. We'll be seeing these more and more with the Renaissance itself. And the baptistry, for was a separate building where parishioners would be baptized, and having this as a separate building was a common thing in early Christian architecture because so many people needed to be baptized. You were converting a lot of pagans to Christianity, and they were being baptized as adults, and so often these were built as separate buildings, and that kind of continued on. This was built in an era when no longer were there pagans anymore, at least not in the Italian area. But that tradition of building a separate baptistry continued on. Nowadays, if you go into a Catholic church or even a Christian church, there's a baptismal font. It's usually on a side chapel or even sometimes right in the front. It's just a little pool of water because now we mostly baptize babies and they're small. So this is the building, and you can just sort of make out here and here on the left and right the doors that are the entrances. So there were 6 of those, or 4 of those, excuse me, I think, that needed to be done. And this was what the competition was for. So, like I said, the 2 sort of front runners in this competition were Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. And it just so happens that we have, and the competition afforded, it gave them each a little bit of money to create a little mock-up, a little casting of a scene, from a biblical scene that would be incorporated into one of the doors. And the competition was to, basically do this mock-up and present it as your model of, hey, this is my skill, but also my artistry. And as it so happens, we actually have still the two submissions, by Brunelleschi and the one by Ghiberti. And the scene assigned for the competition was this Old Testament scene in which Abraham is directed by God to sacrifice his son, to show his faith to God that he would be willing to sacrifice his son. And sure enough, he says, well, okay, I'll do it. And at the very last moment, because he seems committed and he's got this dagger and he's got his son on the altar and he's about ready to slice his throat. And at the very last moment, God sends their archangel Gabriel or whatever down and says, no, stop. I get it. You're devoted. Don't actually slice your son's throat open, right? And so it's a very dramatic scene. And so we see Brunelleschi and Ghiberti's submission showing this scene. So on the left here is Brunelleschi, and here we see Abraham, his son, and here comes the angel swooping down in, as well as just sort of background material. And then over here with Ghiberti, here is Abraham, there's the son on the altar, and here comes the angel swooping in. And so this is literally, these are the two pieces that this committee looked at to make their decision. And it works a little easier in real time when we're in a classroom, but I'm curious what you all think of the two submissions and which one maybe you prefer, just based on looking at this now. And there's no right or wrong answer. Obviously, one or the other was selected, and if you know the answer, don't say. But there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer per se, because both are considered by art scholars to be quite excellent. So pipe up, tell me, or type in the chat, which ones do you like, and which ones maybe, is there a reason why you like one or the other?
Archie looked like he might have a little more detail.
Which one?
The one on the right.
Which one, Jamon? The one on the right, Ghiberti's? Yeah, you think it's got a little more detail to it?
A little bit more going on.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good observation. Yeah. Let's see. Somebody typed in the chat. Owana, you like Brunelleschi's. Who else? So we got one vote for Ghiberti. We got one vote for Brunelleschi. That's a tie. Somebody's got to break the tie here. Anyone? Everybody still with me?
I like more the first one.
The one on the left, Brunelleschi's?
Yeah, first one. I feel like the message is more clear than the other one. It's like less chaotic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a way, Joman was saying how Ghiberti's has a lot of detail. That's really good, right? But it also means sometimes that the story might get lost a little bit in too much detail, right? There's, we'll be talking about Mies van der Rohe later in the semester, and his famous quote was "less is more," right? So I think you have a good point in that Brunelleschi's has, a little more like voids, versus the sort of solid figures. So maybe the story is a little more dramatic or clear there. Anyone else want to weigh in? We got two for Brunelleschi, one for Ghiberti. Anyone? Tim, you got a thought?
I like the one on the right, even though I do think that the one on the left does show the story more clearly. I just like that it has more detail, the one on the right.
Mm-hmm.
I just think
it looks
nice.
Yeah, good. Okay, so another vote for Gaberte. Now we're back tied again, huh? So we do need somebody else to weigh in here to break this tie.
I was gonna say that I also like the one on the left because it's
On
more
the left.
straightforward, like everyone said. The
Hmm.
Brunelleschi one.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
think yeah, there's like a lot more negative spaces. You can really see like what's going on. On the right, it's also nice that it's detailed, but I feel like it's not accentuating the story anymore.
Hmm. Okay. So, very good points, and most would agree that the one on the right, Gilberte's, is more detailed, right? There's just a little more refinement in some of this, and I think that really shows Gilberte's skill in artistry and craftsmanship. A lot of people think it's a little more dramatic. I don't know if you noticed, you can really see the dagger, and it's like he's about to lunge it into his throat. And here comes the archangel down here, to stop him. He also puts the sun more on display here. It's a more front view with his neck sort of exposed. Making it perhaps a little more dramatic. You see the dagger and you see his exposed neck. But of course, a lot of people think that Brunelleschi's is as good or in some cases better. I think the archangel coming down is maybe a little more dramatic in this one. That he's right there, front and center. He's reaching out. He's literally grabbing his arm or his wrist right at the moment he's about to plunge the dagger in. So that has got a lot of drama too, arguably. And as we kind of pointed out, even though the details might not be quite as refined, it's a little clearer. I think the story is a little bit clearer. So there's definitely arguments to be made on both. So the committee, historically had a tough choice to make, but they had to make a decision. So the winner was Gilberte, the one on the right. And this really launched Gilberte's career. Like I say, he'd been a young man, he'd been working as an apprentice, and to get this commission, that alone was going to afford him several years of a prestigious commission to work on that was going to, give him a steady income. And because he had won this important competition, the baptistry is in the center of town. Everybody knows about it. Everybody's going to be going by and seeing his doors, seeing his work. He's going to get a lot more private commissions as well by people saying, "Hey, I want a piece of sculpture or some art or something for myself." And again, Florence, very wealthy town, so there were a lot of wealthy patrons who could afford to hire Gilberte to do work for them privately. And so he found himself the darling child of Florence all of a sudden after 1400 by winning this competition, and really kind of became the most prestigious of Florentine artists and so forth. And so, the question, so here we have the actual doors that were created by Gaberte. They're still intact on the building. These doors here are known as the Gates of Paradise. Like I said, there were different sets of doors, and they have different names. And there are, as you can see, cast in bronze are the different biblical scenes from, that, are similar to what we saw in the competition there. And I got some details here. Here's a detailed panel of a scene. I don't remember what each one of these is, I'm sorry to say, but here's, a little bit of an architectural scene here that's Gothic. You see some pointed arches and ribbed vaulting. So we're still in that Gothic era, and he's portraying that in the architecture behind as a sort of backdrop to the scene that is occurring here. So what happens to Brunelleschi? He's the loser, right? You're not the winner, you're the loser. And, what does he wind up doing? Well, he actually, runs off to Rome with his friend Donatello, who becomes a very famous sculptor as well. And they basically, ostensibly, their mission is they're going to sort of document and do sketching of some of the ancient Roman ruins and stuff. And this is an image of the Roman Forum as it appeared during this era. It had not been excavated. You know, buildings and triumphal arches that you see right here are like half buried under, you know, 1,000 years or more of, you know, sediment and, you know, fill and garbage and forth. And so the two of them, they're basically slumming it. You know, he's brooding. Brunelleschi was known as a very moody man, and so he didn't take well to the loss, and so he kind of goes off and sulks more. But he uses the opportunity to try to be productive and do the sketching, and it turns out to be kind of an important thing later on, as we'll see. Here is probably the most famous sculpture by Donatello, his friend, the David. And this is not quite as famous as Michelangelo's version of David, which I'll be showing you later, but it's a very famous one. This is in one of the museums in Florence. This dates from 1430, so after they had gone off on their little bachelor excursion to Rome. But this is, you know, this is Renaissance art here. This is, you know, a sculpture that is meant to be a realistic portrayal of the human figure. And as we'll start to see, you know, showing emotions and drama, like we were sort of seeing in the two mock-ups for the baptistry. And that's something that had been largely missing in medieval era, the sort of artistry showing drama and human emotions. And we'll see that reemerge in the Renaissance and really hit its climax during the Baroque period. All right, so one thing that Brunelleschi actually is quite significant for is all of this, you know, when he wasn't brooding and probably going out late partying in Rome, his documentation really began to help later architects and artisans do this rediscovery of antiquity. He really helped to recreate the proper proportions of the ancient orders. And again, I'm going to throw out to my students who were in the last semester, what were the three orders? Do you remember what those are? You can yell them out or put them in the text if you want.
Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian.
Yeah, Corinthian, yes. Ionic, actually we'll start with the Doric on the left. That was the most basic, and then the Ionic here in the center, and the Corinthian on the far right. And we talked a little bit about last semester that these orders, they had specific proportions to them. They could be bigger or taller or whatever, depending on the building you were building, but you kept them in the similar proportions. And you can see like the different letters to the height and the width and so forth that went with this. And that also included the architrave and the entablatures on cornices that sat on top of the column itself. This knowledge of these proportions, the proper proportions that the Greeks and Romans used, that actually had been lost. And so, you know, an Italian Gothic builder might do a pseudo Corinthian capital, but it wouldn't be the right scale. It wouldn't be the right proportion. And so one of the early aspects of the Renaissance was to revive that, to understand it. Brunelleschi helps people understand what those proportions would be. And so when you are going to create a Corinthian column again on your building, it should be of the right scale and proportion. So that's not insignificant, even though he didn't get this prestigious award to do the baptistry. He did something else, and this is more art focused than architecture, but he also really sort of discovered, or maybe rediscovered, the geometric formula for perspective drawing. We didn't do sketching in the fall semester because of the pandemic and doing everything online. That's something I sometimes do when we're have a regular class. But if you took art in school, or if you're of an artistic nature, you know the fundamentals of perspective drawing, and you can see an image here on the bottom where there's a vanishing point, right, on a horizon line off in the distance. And all the lines, all come down to that single vanishing point. You might have, this is a one-point perspective, you might have a horizontal line, but any of the other lines are all going to converge onto that single vanishing point. That had been lost. There's art historians think that in antiquity, artists had an understanding of it, and that there was pretty good geometric perspective in Greek and especially in Roman artwork and frescoes, but it certainly had been lost. And there are plenty of examples of art during the medieval era that sort of has a pseudo perspective, but it doesn't have the real tight vanishing point here. Brunelleschi comes to understand how that worked, and he did experiments and he perfected it to the point where he actually started doing some experiments and showing people how that worked. Go to the next slide here. And so here's an excellent example of a Renaissance work by Leonardo da Vinci, very famous, The Last Supper, right? This is one-point perspective, right? The room that the Jesus and the apostles are in is a one-point perspective. And if you were to carry these lines down, you would come to a vanishing point. And in fact, here is in this slide, is a graphic showing that. So here, this horizontal line is that horizon line that you use in perspective. And then you'll note here at the very center, which happens to be Jesus's head, which is not coincidental. He is the center of the scene, right? So he's used as a vanishing point. And so all the lines converge on the vanishing point, i.e. Jesus, right? So there's some metaphor in there as well as actual perspective drawing. And so this painting done by Leonardo is done after Brunelleschi has discovered and has begun to delineate or disseminate, the rules of perspective drawing. So there's a little video that I want you to watch. It's about 4 minutes, and if you go into the Blackboard under course materials, there's a tab in there for course materials. There's a link to the video known, I call it perspective drawing. So if you would go ahead and click on that, watch the video, and in about 4 minutes we'll come back and continue the lecture.